Samuel Greene stepped off the bus with a quiet, heavy sigh. He felt the familiar rush of memories as his boots touched the worn pavement of Main Street. This small southern town was both unchanged and vastly different from the place he'd left behind so many years ago. The streets were just as narrow, the storefronts still worn but charming, and the air carried the faint scent of pine that he associated with long summer nights and cool autumn breezes. It was strange to be back after all he had seen. The horrors of combat, the camaraderie of soldiers, the endurance he'd built in body and mind, all of it felt like a separate life. Here, he wasn't Sergeant Greene, the decorated soldier who had saved lives under fire. Here, he was just Samuel, the kid who used to race bikes down these same streets, and the young man who had been proud to serve a country that was still learning to see him as an equal. He pulled his small bag closer, feeling the weight of his return settle over him. He'd come home for peace, or at least something close to it. He had longed for this, dreamed of quiet nights without the distant echo of gunfire or the weight of duty pressing down on him, and he hoped, more than anything, to feel like he belonged. As he walked, familiar faces turned his way, some nodding, others glancing with what he thought might be wariness. He supposed he looked different now, older, more worn. Or maybe they were simply surprised to see him back at all. His gaze fell upon an old diner on the corner of Main Street. Its sign, half lit, flickered with the same faded letters it had had since he was a boy. Haven's Diner. Back then, it had been a place of laughter and warmth, a space where he'd made memories with friends, talked about dreams, and shared hopes for the future. Perhaps it still is, he thought, feeling a stir of nostalgia as he pushed open the door. The familiar jingle of the bell was met with silence. Conversations hushed as he stepped inside, and a few patrons turned to glance his way. Some faces lit up with recognition, others with discomfort. He offered a polite nod, scanning the room, noting the faint sense of tension that seemed to have settled since his entry. Samuel moved to a booth by the window, taking a seat and reaching for a menu out of habit. His stomach churned with a mixture of hunger and apprehension, though he did his best to ignore the latter. He had looked forward to a simple meal, something to remind him of home. But the waitress behind the counter was staring at him, lips pressed tight, her eyes shifting uncertainly toward the back of the diner where the manager stood. He caught her eye and offered a slight smile, hoping to break the tension, but she averted her gaze, whispering to the man behind her. The manager, a stocky man with graying hair, stepped forward, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His expression was guarded as he looked Samuel over, taking him in with a measured, uneasy look. Samuel's heart sank, a feeling he had hoped he wouldn't have to face again creeping over him. He had expected to find familiarity, warmth, maybe even welcome, but what he saw in the manager's eyes was anything but that. The manager cleared his throat and approached Samuel's booth. "Sir," he began, his voice low but firm, I don't think we can serve you today." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, louder than if they'd been shouted. Samuel felt a familiar pang, an ache he thought he had left behind on battlefields overseas, not here, in the quiet of his hometown. He looked up, meeting the manager's gaze, his voice steady but laced with a quiet strength. "Is that right?" he asked, his words simple but filled with unspoken meaning. He wanted to give the man a chance, one opportunity to reconsider, but the manager's eyes held fast, his resolve unmoving. "Yeah," the manager replied, his tone gruff but uneasy. We don't serve your kind here. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is." Samuel felt a chill spread through him, a mixture of disbelief and quiet anger. This was his town. He had grown up here, worn down these streets, bled and sweat for this country, and now he was being turned away like a stranger in his own home. The patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away, others watching with a mixture of sympathy and silent guilt. He felt the weight of their gazes but kept his own steady on the manager, refusing to look down, refusing to shrink. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice calm but resolute. "But I'll be staying." And with that, he sat back, crossing his arms and settling into the booth, his expression unwavering. The manager hesitated, glancing at the waitress and then back at Samuel. There was a flicker of something like shame in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened stare. He turned and walked back to the counter, leaving Samuel alone in his quiet protest. Samuel looked out the window, watching as people walked by, oblivious to the moment unfolding inside. A few patrons shifted, murmuring quietly, their words lost in the silence that stretched around him. He knew this act would not endear him to everyone, but he had made his choice. He wouldn't leave just because someone else's prejudice had found its way into this town. He had fought for more than that. He was worth more than that. And as he sat there, his calm defiance unbroken, he felt a quiet strength build within him, steady and unshakable. If he had to sit here alone, as a reminder of the dignity he held close to his heart, then so be it. The minutes passed slowly, each second stretching into what felt like hours. Samuel remained seated, looking out the window with a calm resolve. He knew people were watching him, whispering, unsure of what to make of the scene. His choice to stay, quiet but unyielding, was a statement that spoke volumes. He was here, in his hometown, and he would not be pushed out or silenced. A young woman with her hair tied back in a loose bun entered the diner, her cheerful expression fading as she noticed the unusual silence. She looked around, sensing the tension in the air, her eyes eventually landing on Samuel. He recognized her as Emma, the daughter of an old neighbor, now grown into a young woman. She had been just a child when he left, but there was a light of recognition in her eyes. "Samuel?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the quiet. He nodded, offering her a gentle smile. "It's good to see you, Emma." Emma hesitated, glancing around at the other patrons, her brow furrowing as she took in the scene. The waitress's averted eyes, the manager's tight-lipped expression, and Samuel's composed demeanor painted a picture she didn't fully understand, but she sensed the injustice in it. You all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Yes, I'm all right," Samuel replied, his tone calm but firm. "Just taking a seat? Haven't been here in a long time." Emma's lips pressed together in a thin line as she studied him. Her father had spoken about Samuel, about his service and sacrifices, about the pride he'd brought to their small town. It didn't sit right with her, seeing him treated like this. Her eyes flicked to the manager, and though she didn't speak, her silent condemnation was clear. Emma moved to sit across from Samuel, an act of quiet solidarity. Her presence, though small in gesture, sent ripples through the diner. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Others looked away, their guilt palpable. But one or two nodded subtly, as if grateful that someone had finally taken a stand. The bell above the door jingled again, and a familiar face stepped in. Ryan, the town's local journalist. He noticed Samuel right away, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he took in the atmosphere. Ryan had known Samuel since they were kids. He'd admired his bravery from afar, his unyielding commitment to serving his country. He moved to the counter, eyes narrowing at the manager. "Barnes," he said, his tone calm but authoritative. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Barnes shifted, avoiding Ryan's gaze. "Nothing to tell," he replied, his voice defensive. "Just keeping things the way they've always been." Ryan's jaw tightened, and he glanced back at Samuel. There was a quiet fury in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "Keeping things the way they've always been," he repeated, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Is that your excuse for disrespecting a man who fought for this country?" Barnes didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin, stubborn line. He'd always held a firm grip on his beliefs, no matter how outdated they were. He didn't appreciate being challenged, especially not by the town's most vocal reporter. Ryan's gaze softened as he looked at Samuel. "I'd like to do a piece on you, Samuel," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I think people should know about the way a decorated veteran is being treated in his own town." A murmur spread through the room, some patrons casting furtive glances at Barnes. Emma nodded in quiet agreement, her expression resolute. Samuel, however, held up a hand, his face calm. "Thank you, Ryan," he said gently. "But I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here because I have as much right to sit here as anyone else." The strength in Samuel's voice was undeniable, unshakable. His words weren't a demand. They were a statement of fact. He wasn't asking for permission. He was claiming a right that had always been his. Ryan pulled out his phone, snapping a quick photo of Samuel seated at the booth. "Trouble or not, people need to see this," he said, his voice determined. "This town has hidden behind its old ways for too long." Barnes glared at Ryan, his cheeks flushing with anger. "You're just stirring things up," he muttered. "Things were just fine before." Ryan met Barnes's glare with a steady look. "Fine for who, Barnes?" he challenged. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending that the way things have always been is the way they should be." The tension in the diner was thick, and Samuel could feel the weight of every eye on him. But he remained calm, grounded. He hadn't come here to stir up conflict, but he wouldn't leave simply because someone thought he didn't belong. Emma, still seated across from him, leaned forward, her voice soft. "I'm with you, Samuel. Whatever you need, just let me know." He gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Emma. Just being here is enough." She smiled, and it was a look of quiet admiration. She understood, perhaps better than most, that Samuel's stand wasn't about making noise or causing trouble. It was about claiming the respect and dignity that were his by right. Ryan turned to the other patrons. "I'm going to write about this," he announced, "and if anyone here has anything to say, now's your chance." A few people shifted, avoiding his gaze, but one older woman, Mrs. Jefferson, a lifelong resident, spoke up. I think what's happening here isn't right," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere. "Samuel served this country. He's one of us. He deserves better." Her words were met with a few nods and murmurs of agreement. The sentiment in the room was changing, subtly but unmistakably. Barnes, however, stood resolute, his arms crossed over his chest, refusing to budge. Ryan took a step back, phone still in hand, and spoke directly to Barnes. "You can try to ignore this, but the world's changing, Barnes, and sooner or later, you're going to have to decide if you want to be part of that change." Barnes clenched his jaw, unwilling to respond. But the look in his eyes revealed a flicker of doubt, a glimmer of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Outside the diner, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the whispers of what was happening inside. Word spread quickly in a town this small, and soon people were pressing their faces against the windows, watching as Samuel sat calmly in his booth, an unwavering presence of quiet defiance. Samuel looked out at the gathering crowd, his face calm, his heart steady. He hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't wanted to become a spectacle, but as he looked into the eyes of the people watching him, he realized that maybe this was bigger than him. Maybe this was a moment that could change more than just his own life. It could change the lives of everyone in this town. And so he sat, resolute and unmovable, a quiet symbol of dignity in a place that had tried to deny him just that. The words of others rose around him, murmurs of agreement, nods of support, the weight of solidarity growing by the minute. Samuel felt a quiet strength filling him, deeper than he had ever known. He was no longer alone. Samuel remained in his seat, watching the gathering crowd grow thicker outside the diner's windows. What had started as a small, tense confrontation had blossomed into something larger, something he could feel pulsing around him like a heartbeat. His quiet resistance had struck a nerve, and the people of the town were waking up to it in ways he hadn't anticipated. Ryan's article hit the local paper the very next day, the headline stark and attention-grabbing. "Local hero turned away at home. When will change come to our town?" It was a scathing but honest account of what had unfolded in the diner, laying bare the discrimination that simmered just below the surface. Within hours of publication, the story gained traction, spreading far beyond their small town as national media picked it up. The first few reporters arrived within days, their vans lining the narrow street in front of the diner. Curious onlookers joined them, snapping photos and recording videos. They weren't there just to witness Samuel. They were there because his quiet protest had become a rallying cry, something that resonated deeply with people far and wide. News outlets began broadcasting his story, interviews with townspeople aired, and public figures across the state started taking notice. As word spread, support poured in from unexpected places. Veterans from neighboring towns arrived, some in uniform, standing solemnly outside the diner in solidarity. Students from a nearby university organized a peaceful march to Greene Square, carrying signs that read, "Dignity for all," and "Veterans deserve respect." Each sign bore a message rooted in Samuel's quiet defiance, each marcher a reminder that he was not alone. In the diner, however, Barnes was seething. The manager's attempts to ignore the situation only backfired as more and more people turned their backs on his establishment. Regulars who had once been loyal stopped coming, uncomfortable with the growing reputation of exclusion associated with the diner. Even the sheriff had approached Barnes, warning him that his refusal to make amends was doing lasting damage, not just to his business but to the town's image. But Barnes was stubborn, holding fast to the belief that he was justified. This was his diner, his livelihood, and he believed he had the right to serve whoever he wanted. He couldn't understand why the townspeople, especially those who had grown up alongside him, were suddenly turning against him over one man's refusal to leave. Meanwhile, Samuel's quiet protest continues. Samuel continued to visit the diner each day, sitting in his booth by the window, unfazed by the growing attention. His presence was an act of steadfast resilience, a silent reminder of the dignity he carried with him everywhere he went. Emma, who had been the first to sit with him, continued to join him each day, sometimes bringing friends who shared her determination to stand by Samuel's side. As the crowd outside the diner swelled with supporters, Samuel felt a new, unexpected hope flickering in his heart. What had started as a quiet stand for his own dignity had evolved into something much greater, a movement, born out of the simple belief that everyone deserved respect. Ryan, ever the storyteller, had taken it upon himself to document everything. He interviewed townspeople, recorded Samuel's words, and even caught candid shots of the peaceful gatherings around Greene Square. His reporting became a record of the town's transformation, a testament to the power of standing up, even if only by sitting down. One evening, after the diner had closed for the night, Ryan approached Samuel as he stood alone in Greene Square. The square was empty now, the sounds of the day having faded into a peaceful hush. Ryan's camera was slung over his shoulder, his notebook tucked under his arm, but his expression was one of quiet awe. "Samuel," Ryan began, his voice soft, "I don't think you realize what you've started here." Samuel looked at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I never planned for it to be this way," he admitted. "I just wanted to sit down for a meal." Ryan nodded, glancing out over the empty square. "And yet, you've given people hope. You've shown them what it means to hold on to dignity, to stand for something without ever raising your voice. That's rare, Samuel, and it's powerful." Samuel looked down, his mind heavy with the weight of Ryan's words. He had always believed in treating people with respect, in living his life in a way that honored the values he had fought for. But seeing the effect of his quiet stand, the unity it had sparked, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated. "I guess sometimes change doesn't need to be loud," Samuel said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's enough just to be present, to let people see you and understand why you're there." Ryan smiled, reaching into his bag to pull out a newspaper. "Well, I hope you're ready for even more attention, because they're talking about you all over the state now. People are watching, and they're inspired." Samuel glanced at the headline. There, in bold letters, were the words, "Veterans' Quiet Protest, the stand that sparked a movement." The article chronicled not just the events in the diner, but the impact Samuel's silent stand was having on the town and beyond. It was a story that had struck a chord, resonating with people who understood the pain of being dismissed, ignored, or marginalized. As he read, a surge of emotion washed over him, pride, humility, and a deep-seated hope that this moment of unity would last. He had spent years fighting overseas, never expecting to have to fight again in his own town. But this battle was different. It was one he hadn't chosen, but one he knew he could no longer walk away from. "Thank you, Ryan," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "I never asked for any of this, but if it means something to people, if it brings about some kind of change, then maybe it's worth it." Ryan nodded, his respect for Samuel evident in his eyes. "It already is worth it, Samuel, and I think you're just getting started." In the days that followed, the diner's business continued to suffer. Barnes stubbornly refused to apologize, his pride preventing him from acknowledging his mistake. But as the movement grew, with more people boycotting his diner and choosing to support Samuel's stand, he began to feel the consequences in ways he couldn't ignore. The youth in town, led by Emma and a few of her friends, began organizing small events in Greene Square. They held peaceful gatherings, sharing stories of resilience, reading passages on equality and respect, and singing songs that lifted the spirits of everyone in attendance. Each gathering was a quiet celebration of unity, a testament to the power of solidarity. Samuel often joined them, sitting with the young people, listening to their stories, and encouraging them to continue standing for what they believed in. One afternoon, Emma approached Samuel with an idea. "We want to start a group, something for the younger generation, a place where people can come together, share stories, talk about change. Would you be willing to help us?" Samuel's face softened and he nodded without hesitation. "I'd be honored," he replied, his voice filled with pride. "What you're doing is important, Emma. Keep going, keep believing in each other." The youth group quickly became a beacon of hope, drawing in members from neighboring towns and cities. They called themselves the Greene Collective in honor of Samuel, using his stand as the foundation for their mission to foster understanding, equality, and unity. They organized events, volunteered in the community, and supported one another, their collective voice growing stronger with each passing day. The sheriff steps in. As tensions reached a boiling point, the sheriff decided it was time to step in. He visited Barnes at the diner, his face stern as he laid out the reality of the situation. "Barnes," he said, his voice firm, "you're tearing this town apart. People are hurt, divided, all because you couldn't bring yourself to treat a man with respect." Barnes shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet the sheriff's gaze. "It's my diner," he muttered defensively. "I've got a right to serve who I want." The sheriff shook his head, disappointment evident in his eyes. "You had a right to make a choice, but that doesn't make it the right choice. This town is changing, and you're the one being left behind." As he turned to leave, the sheriff's parting words lingered in the air. "Think about it, Barnes, because if you don't make amends, it might just be too late." And with that, he left, leaving Barnes to grapple with the consequences of his actions, and the realization that change was no longer just a possibility, but an inevitability. Absolutely. Let's continue to expand on the story while incorporating the elements from your original prompt: emotional hooks, cliffhangers, mini-hooks, a brisk pace with constant twists, moral lessons, and an impactful call to action in each chapter. Here's the next part, with added depth to keep the tension high and sustain reader engagement. Word of Samuel's silent protest continued to spread beyond the boundaries of their small town. Social media buzzed with posts and tweets, and soon enough, even state news networks picked up the story. Some reporters focused on Samuel's decorated military service, contrasting his valor with the treatment he was receiving. Others framed it as a modern-day civil rights movement, the battle between an outdated tradition and a community's push for change. One morning, Samuel sat in his usual booth, sipping a cup of coffee that Emma had brewed for him. The atmosphere in the diner was thick with anticipation. A small crowd of locals had gathered outside, watching as reporters set up cameras and prepared for the day's interviews. Even those who didn't necessarily support Samuel's stance were finding it difficult to ignore the attention the town was receiving. It was clear that something monumental was brewing. Across the table, Ryan sat with his notepad, glancing at Samuel thoughtfully. "Samuel, you've created something incredible here. People are listening. They're watching. What do you think they're waiting to see?" Samuel paused, considering Ryan's question. "I think they're waiting to see what happens when one man chooses to hold his ground without anger," he replied, his voice soft but resonant. "I'm not here to fight anyone. I'm here because I believe in respect, something everyone deserves." Ryan nodded, his admiration for Samuel deepening. "But, do you ever think about how this could end?" he asked. "I mean, Barnes is standing firm, and there are people who think he has a right to do so. It's complicated." "It's always complicated," Samuel replied, his gaze steady. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Just as he finished speaking, the diner door swung open, and the sheriff stepped inside, his face set in a grim expression. He approached Samuel's table, tipping his hat respectfully. "Samuel, Barnes wants to speak with you," he said, his voice low. He's not too happy about the way things have been going." The sheriff's words hung in the air, a tense pause stretching between them. Samuel set down his coffee cup, glancing at Ryan, who was already scribbling in his notebook, capturing every detail. Samuel stood, a calm resolve radiating from him. "All right," he said quietly. "Lead the way." Meanwhile, the crowd outside. Gross and outside, the crowd had thickened, a mix of townspeople, supporters from nearby cities, and journalists, all waiting to see what would happen next. People held signs with messages of solidarity, and a few wore T-shirts bearing Samuel's image with the words, "Respect for all," emblazoned across the front. The crowd's energy was palpable, buzzing with curiosity and anticipation. As Samuel walked out, the sheriff beside him, the crowd quieted, all eyes on the two men as they made their way toward the back of the diner where Barnes waited. Emma followed at a respectful distance, her face filled with worry but also determination. She had come to see Samuel as a mentor, a beacon of strength, and she wasn't about to let him face Barnes alone. In the dimly lit storage room at the back of the diner, Barnes stood with his arms crossed, his face hardened but lined with visible tension. He glanced at Samuel with an expression that was both confrontational and conflicted, as if he was grappling with his own emotions. "Samuel," Barnes began, his voice tight, "you've caused quite a stir. People are saying things, making me out to be the villain here." Samuel held his gaze, his face calm and unwavering. "I didn't cause anything, Barnes," he replied evenly. "I just came here for a meal." Barnes's jaw clenched. "And now the whole town's in an uproar. Business has dropped. People who used to come here every day are staying away. This is my livelihood, Samuel. I've got a right to run my business the way I see fit." Samuel nodded, listening patiently. "You do, Barnes. But everyone here has a right to respect and dignity. That includes me. I serve this country. I came back to the same town I grew up in, hoping to be welcomed. Instead, I was turned away." Barnes's face softened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his expression. He looked away, his shoulders sagging slightly as he absorbed Samuel's words. There was a beat of silence, thick with unspoken thoughts as he considered his response. Maybe I don't know how things work anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I grew up with certain ways, certain values. It's hard to change something you've known all your life." Samuel's face softened as well, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "Change isn't easy, Barnes. I know that as well as anyone. But sometimes, holding on to the past hurts everyone, including yourself." The words hit Barnes like a weight, and he closed his eyes, his fists clenching as he fought with his own pride and prejudice. His struggle was visible, and for the first time, Samuel saw him not as an adversary but as a man caught between the comfort of old beliefs and the pressing need to evolve. Barnes took a shaky breath, his voice unsteady as he finally spoke. "Samuel, I don't know if I can just change overnight, but maybe there's a way we can come to some sort of understanding." Samuel's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and caution. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm saying, maybe you can help me see things differently," Barnes said, his gaze meeting Samuel's with a flicker of vulnerability. "This town? We could all use a little of what you're standing for. Maybe I just need someone to show me how." It was a moment of profound significance, the beginning of a possible reconciliation. Barnes, though still resistant, was offering a tentative olive branch, a small step toward the change Samuel hoped to see. Samuel nodded, his voice warm but steady. "I'll help you, Barnes, but it has to start with respect. It has to start with recognizing that we all belong here." Barnes's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time there was a hint of a genuine smile on his face. "All right, Samuel, let's see if we can find a way to make this right." Later that afternoon, as news of Barnes and Samuel's conversation spread, people gathered outside the diner, eager to hear what would happen next. Rumors swirled that Barnes would make a public statement, and the crowd grew, a mix of supporters, skeptics, and those who simply wanted to witness history unfold. Barnes stepped outside, his face solemn as he addressed the crowd. Emma stood beside Samuel, her eyes filled with hope as she watched Barnes prepare to speak. The sheriff stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but supportive. Barnes cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he began. I know some of you think I was wrong," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I let my own stubbornness get in the way of doing what's right." He paused, glancing at Samuel, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Barnes swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "Samuel here. He's shown me that respect isn't something you give based on someone's background or beliefs. It's something everyone deserves, no matter what." The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval, others watching with uncertainty. Barnes took another deep breath, his voice steadying. "I can't change the past, but I can change how I move forward. I'm willing to learn, to understand what it means to show respect and kindness to everyone who walks through these doors." The applause started softly but quickly grew, filling the air with the sounds of approval and forgiveness. People cheered, some even wiping away tears, as Barnes finally extended his hand to Samuel in a gesture of reconciliation. Samuel accepted it, shaking Barnes's hand with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. Emma, overwhelmed with emotion, squeezed Samuel's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You really did it." Samuel nodded, his face filled with calm satisfaction. This moment wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been denied, ignored, or treated as less than. His small act of defiance had become a beacon, a reminder that change didn't have to be loud. It only had to be steady, rooted in the unshakable belief that everyone deserved respect. As the crowd began to disperse, a journalist approached Samuel, microphone in hand. "Mr. Greene, what message do you want to leave with people today?" Samuel looked out over the square, his gaze steady and warm. "My message is simple," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "Sometimes standing up for what's right doesn't mean fighting. It means sitting down, holding steady, and showing others that respect is something we all deserve. If my stand can inspire even one person to live with a little more kindness, then that's enough for me." The journalist nodded, moved by Samuel's words, and the crowd erupted into applause once again. And as Samuel stood in Greene Square, surrounded by a community finally willing to embrace change, he knew that this was only the beginning. As days turned into weeks, the impact of Barnes's public apology reverberated through the town. People who had once been passive onlookers felt inspired to engage more actively in the conversation about respect, dignity, and change. Samuel's story became a symbol for transformation, and Greene Square quickly became the heart of the town's movement toward inclusion. Emma and her youth group, the newly formed What Greene Collective, organized community events every weekend, bringing together people of all backgrounds and ages. Samuel attended each one, sitting with the young activists, answering their questions, and sharing stories from his military service that underscored his core beliefs. It was a peaceful, unifying presence in the town that had once looked the other way when discrimination occurred. At each event, he could see the slow but steady shift in people's hearts. Families who had once kept their distance now sat beside him, asking questions, engaging in conversation, and, most importantly, listening. He could sense the pride in his community growing, a pride rooted not in exclusion but in the strength that came from standing together. The diner, now openly welcoming to everyone, became a gathering place where people met to talk, to listen, and to learn. Barnes, humbled by his journey, made genuine efforts to foster an inclusive atmosphere. The old booths and counters took on new meaning as people shared their stories over coffee, finding common ground and healing from years of division. One evening, Emma, Samuel, and Ryan sat at the diner with Barnes, discussing ways to keep the momentum going. The youth group was planning a unity walk to celebrate the town's newfound spirit of acceptance, and they hoped to involve as many locals as possible. "Samuel," Emma asked, her eyes shining with excitement, "would you lead the walk with us? It would mean so much to have you at the front, as a symbol of everything we're trying to achieve." Samuel chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Emma, I'd be honored. But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about all of us finding a way to move forward together." Barnes, who had been quietly listening, nodded in agreement. "You're right, Samuel. And maybe this diner can be a place where people feel safe, where they know they belong." Ryan, always eager to capture the town's story, chimed in. "Why don't we make it official? We could name the walk after Samuel. It would be a way to honor him and remind everyone of how one man's stand changed our town." Barnes agreed, and together they decided on the name, the Greene Walk for Dignity. On the morning of the Greene Walk, townspeople gathered in the square, holding signs with messages of unity and kindness. Children clutched small flags bearing the words, "Respect for All," and elderly residents sat on folding chairs, watching with pride as the crowd gathered. Samuel looked out at the sea of faces, both familiar and new, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. As the walk began, he led the crowd through the town's main street, Emma and Ryan at his side. People walked hand in hand, marching not in anger, but in celebration of their shared humanity. The march became a reflection of everything they had fought for, each step a reminder that they had chosen a better way forward. Barnes, standing by the diner as the march passed, waved to Samuel, his expression one of sincere respect and gratitude. Samuel nodded back, knowing that Barnes's journey had been as transformative as his own. They were no longer divided by past misunderstandings. They had grown into allies, working toward a common goal. As they reached Green Square, Samuel took the microphone, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Today, we're not here to dwell on the past," he said. "We're here to celebrate the future we're building together, a future where everyone belongs, where dignity and respect are given freely, and where our town can be a home for all." The crowd cheered, and Samuel felt the power of their collective spirit lifting him. He realized then that this moment wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had chosen to stand with him. As photos and videos of the Greene Walk spread online, the story went viral again, capturing the hearts of people across the nation. News outlets praised the town's transformation, and social media buzzed with stories of similar movements starting in other communities. People saw in Samuel's story a reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance could inspire profound change. Soon, Samuel received an invitation to speak at a civil rights rally in Washington, D.C. The invitation was a great honor, and though he felt humbled, he accepted it with a sense of duty. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who believed in a world where respect and justice could thrive. Emma, Ryan, and a few others from the youth group accompanied him to Washington, eager to witness Samuel's impact on a larger stage. The night before the rally, they sat with Samuel in their hotel room, discussing his speech and reflecting on how far they'd come. "Samuel," Emma said softly, "you've changed so many lives. You've given us hope and a path forward. What do you hope people take away from your story?" Samuel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I hope they understand that change doesn't have to be loud or violent. Sometimes it's enough to hold your ground and show others that dignity is a right, not a privilege. I hope people remember that kindness and respect can be as powerful as any protest. The next day, Samuel took the stage at the rally, standing before a crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see. People held signs, cheered, and listened intently as he began his speech. "I came from a small town where respect wasn't always given freely," he began, his voice steady. "But when I sat down in that diner, it wasn't just to prove a point. It was to remind people that we all deserve dignity, no matter our backgrounds or beliefs." His words resonated with the crowd, and as he continued, he spoke of the town's journey, the people who had come together, and the power of unity over division. He shared the story of Barnes's apology, the support of the youth group, and the community's march for dignity. His message was simple but profound. We can be better when we choose to stand together. As he finished, the crowd erupted into applause, moved by the depth of his words and the authenticity of his message. Samuel stepped back, humbled but proud, knowing that his journey had inspired not just his town, but people everywhere who had struggled to find their own voices. Back in his hometown, Greene Square was now more than just a gathering place. It was a landmark, a symbol of hope and resilience. A plaque had been installed, bearing the words, "In honor of Samuel Greene, whose quiet strength reminded us that dignity is everyone's right." The youth group continued its work, organizing events, volunteer projects, and educational programs. Emma became one of its most passionate leaders, dedicating herself to carrying on Samuel's legacy of respect and unity. And Barnes, too, continued to change. The diner, once a place of exclusion, had become a hub of diversity and community spirit. People of all backgrounds gathered there, sharing meals, laughter, and stories, breaking down the barriers that had once divided them. Samuel's impact extended far beyond his own life, touching people from all walks of life. His message had become a legacy, passed down to new generations, each one drawing strength from his example. Years later, a group of schoolchildren gathered in Greene Square, listening as their teacher told them the story of Samuel Greene. They sat in rapt attention, their faces filled with wonder as they learned about the man who had sat down to take a stand. "Samuel Greene showed us that you don't need to be loud to be heard," the teacher said. "He taught us that real courage is quiet and steady, and he reminded us that each of us has the power to make a difference." As the children looked up at the plaque, their young minds filled with dreams of their own, Samuel's legacy lived on in each of them. His stand had become more than a single moment in time. It had become a lesson, a guiding light, a call to action that would echo across generations. In Greene Square, the spirit of unity and respect remained, a lasting reminder of the day one man chose to sit down and, in doing so, lifted an entire town to new heights. Months after the rally in Washington, Samuel's story had reached countless communities across the country. Inspired by his message, people everywhere began hosting local events, using his journey as a model for their own grassroots efforts toward inclusion and respect. Realizing the potential to create lasting change, Emma and Ryan approached Samuel with an idea that would extend his legacy even further. "Samuel," Emma said one evening, her eyes alight with excitement, "we've been thinking about a way to take what we've started here and bring it to other towns and cities. What if we created a foundation in your name, something that could fund community programs, scholarships, and workshops on inclusion?" Ryan nodded eagerly, adding, "We could call it the Greene Foundation, dedicated to your principles of dignity and unity. It would be a way for future generations to learn from what you started." Samuel listened, humbled by their proposal. He could see the passion in their faces, their belief in the power of his story. The idea of a foundation, a lasting institution that would embody the values he'd fought for, was overwhelming, but also deeply meaningful. "I never expected this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But if this foundation can inspire even one person to live with more kindness, to see each other as equals, then I would be honored." And so, the Greene Foundation was born. With the help of donations from supporters near and far, Emma, Ryan, and a board of community leaders launched the foundation, dedicated to funding programs that encouraged unity, supported underprivileged youth, and provided educational resources on tolerance and civil rights. It wasn't just a way to preserve Samuel's legacy. It was a vehicle for change, empowering people across the country to take action in their own communities. The Foundation's first major initiative was a project called Stories of Dignity, a series of workshops and storytelling sessions in schools, community centers, and public spaces. The goal was to create spaces where people could share their own experiences with respect, prejudice, and resilience, fostering empathy and understanding among participants. Emma, now one of the Foundation's leading voices, took on the role of coordinating these workshops. She saw firsthand the impact of people sharing their stories, opening up about hardships they had faced and the strength they had found in overcoming them. Each story brought the Foundation's mission to life, proving that Samuel's message could resonate across any distance, any background. One of the first workshops was held in Greene Square, where Samuel sat alongside Emma, listening as young people shared their dreams and fears, inspired by his journey. One young man, a high school senior named Marcus, spoke about facing discrimination in sports due to his background. "I always felt like I had to work twice as hard, just to prove that I belonged," Marcus admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Hearing about you, Mr. Greene, has shown me that sometimes standing up doesn't mean pushing back. It means holding firm, showing the world who you are no matter what." Samuel nodded, moved by Marcus's words. "You're exactly right," he replied. "Strength comes from knowing who you are and standing by it, no matter what others think. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." The workshop brought the community closer, bridging divides and building connections. And as the Foundation continued to hold events in nearby towns and cities, the Stories of Dignity project grew into a national program, giving people everywhere a platform to share their experiences and find common ground. The next initiative of the Greene Foundation was the Samuel Greene Scholarship Fund, aimed at supporting young people pursuing careers in social justice, education, and community organizing. The scholarships were awarded to students who exemplified Samuel's principles, those who demonstrated a commitment to creating positive change in their communities. The first recipient was Marcus, who had shared his story during one of the Foundation's workshops. He was accepted to a top university with a focus on social work, inspired by Samuel's journey to make a difference in the world. When he received the scholarship, he approached Samuel, his face lit with gratitude. "Mr. Greene," Marcus said, shaking his hand, "I promise to use this opportunity to follow in your footsteps, to stand up for others, just like you did for us." Samuel's eyes softened, and he gave Marcus's hand a firm shake. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. Remember, you don't have to fight to make a difference. You just have to be true to yourself and your values." The scholarship fund quickly grew, with donations pouring in from people across the country who had been moved by Samuel's story. Each scholarship awarded was a testament to the impact of his stand, a legacy carried forward by young people committed to building a more inclusive world. Back in their hometown, the diner transformed into a community hub, a space where people gathered to connect and discuss issues of social justice, education, and community development. Barnes, once hesitant to accept change, embraced his new role with a sense of purpose. He had even hired a diverse staff, welcoming people from all backgrounds to work at the diner and share their stories with customers. On weekends, the diner hosted events organized by the Foundation, including discussion panels, film screenings, and storytelling nights. It became a place where people of all ages could come together, break down barriers, and celebrate their shared humanity. Greene Square, located just outside the diner, was filled with laughter, conversation, and the buzz of a town that had come together in unity. One Saturday evening, Samuel was seated in his favorite booth, watching as the diner filled with people who had come for a storytelling event. He glanced around, taking in the lively atmosphere, the smiles on people's faces, and the warmth that had replaced the tension of those early days. Barnes approached Samuel, setting down a cup of coffee with a respectful nod. "You know, Samuel," he began, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "I didn't understand it at first. But seeing what this place has become, seeing how people come together here, I get it now. I'm proud to be part of this." Samuel smiled, meeting Barnes's gaze. "I'm glad, Barnes. Change isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." Barnes nodded, glancing around at the crowd. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." As the foundation grew, Samuel received a letter that took him by surprise. It was an invitation from a well-known civil rights organization, inviting him to accept an honorary award for his contribution to social justice and community transformation. The ceremony was to be held in Washington, D.C., with leaders, activists, and community organizers from across the country in attendance. Samuel hesitated, unsure if he was ready to accept such public recognition. He had always considered himself a humble man, one who had simply done what he believed was right. But Emma and Ryan encouraged him, reminding him that his story had touched lives far beyond their small town. "You've inspired so many people, Samuel," Emma said. "This award isn't just for you. It's for everyone who's learned from you, everyone who's been moved to make a difference because of your stand." Finally, Samuel agreed, understanding that this was an opportunity to further the Greene Foundation's mission and to spread his message even wider. When he arrived in Washington, he was met with a standing ovation, the audience filled with people whose lives had been touched by his story. As he accepted the award, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his journey had become something much larger than himself. The awards ceremony sparked renewed interest in the Greene Foundation, and soon towns and cities across the nation began reaching out, eager to host foundation events and establish local chapters. People from all walks of life wanted to bring Samuel's message of dignity and respect to their own communities, inspired by his unwavering commitment to unity. The foundation launched a national initiative, partnering with schools, community centers, and organizations to promote values of respect, inclusion, and social justice. Volunteers from across the country joined the cause, organizing workshops, mentorship programs, and events that encouraged people to build bridges and break down walls of division. Emma and Ryan led the expansion, with Samuel's guidance creating a network of activists, educators, and supporters who shared a common goal: to create a world where everyone felt valued, respected, and seen. And, as the Greene Foundation grew, so did Samuel's legacy. His story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even a single act of quiet resistance could spark a movement, changing lives and inspiring generations to come. Years later, Green Square became a historic landmark, a place where people gathered to honor Samuel's legacy and celebrate the values he had embodied. His statue, standing tall at the entrance of the square, was a reminder of the man who had chosen to sit down in dignity and, in doing so, had lifted up an entire town. The Greene Foundation continued to thrive, with chapters in every major city, each one dedicated to Samuel's mission of respect and unity. Children learned his story in school, activists cited his example in their speeches, and families made annual visits to Green Square, telling their children about the veteran who had changed the world with nothing more than quiet strength and unshakable faith in humanity. In the end, Samuel's legacy lived on, not just in the foundation, the square, or the diner, but in the hearts of everyone he had inspired. His journey had become a light for all who sought to make a difference, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that true change begins with a single choice to stand, or sit, steadfast in one's belief in justice and dignity for all. And though Samuel himself had long since passed, his spirit remained, a quiet, enduring presence that would forever guide those who followed in his footsteps, carrying forward his message of respect, unity, and the simple, profound power of kindness. As the Greene Foundation continued to grow, Emma and Ryan, alongside other dedicated members of the community, worked tirelessly to expand its influence. They established programs aimed at educating youth on empathy, inclusion, and leadership. Schools across the state began implementing Greene Days, special events where students learned about Samuel's story, discussed topics like kindness and respect, and participated in community service projects. One of these Greene Days was particularly significant for Marcus, the scholarship recipient who was now a sophomore at university. He returned to his hometown, eager to give back to the community that had uplifted him and guided him onto his path. Standing in front of a room full of high school students, he spoke of his journey, how he had faced discrimination in sports, and how Samuel's quiet strength had shown him a better way. "Mr. Greene taught me that real strength isn't about being the loudest or the toughest," Marcus shared. "It's about knowing your worth and standing up for what's right, even if you're standing alone. That's the kind of strength that changes lives." The students listened in awe, some nodding with understanding as Marcus recounted Samuel's influence on his life. As the session ended, a young girl named Mia approached him with a shy smile. "Do you think I could do what you're doing one day?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Marcus knelt down to her level, looking her in the eyes with a smile. "Absolutely, Mia. All it takes is a belief in yourself and a willingness to make a difference. And remember, it doesn't matter how small the act. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impact." With Green Square now a cherished historical site, the town became a place of pilgrimage for people who had been inspired by Samuel's story. The town council, recognizing the significance of his legacy, decided to create a visitor center next to the square, where people could learn about Samuel's life and the values he had lived by. The visitor center housed artifacts from Samuel's life, his military medals, his handwritten notes, and the small notepad Ryan had used to capture Samuel's first protest at the diner. Each exhibit was designed to give visitors a sense of Samuel's journey, allowing them to walk in his shoes, even if only for a few moments. One section of the visitor center displayed letters and messages sent to the Greene Foundation from people around the world. Each letter told a story of how Samuel's message had inspired individuals and communities, of how people had chosen to stand up against injustice in their own lives because of his example. In the heart of the visitor center, a quiet room was dedicated solely to reflection. Visitors could sit in silence, listening to recordings of Samuel's speeches and interviews, letting his words sink in. The room became a sacred space, a place where people came to reflect on how they, too, could live with dignity and respect. As the Greene Foundation's reach extended nationwide, Emma and Ryan organized the first annual Greene Foundation Summit. The summit was held in Washington, D.C., drawing leaders, activists, educators, and young people from across the country. It was a 3-day event filled with workshops, panel discussions, and keynote speeches, all centered around the themes of inclusion, justice, and peaceful resistance. Samuel, now in his late 80s, was the guest of honor. Though he had grown frail with age, his spirit remained as strong as ever. He stood before a room of thousands, his voice soft but filled with the same conviction that had sparked a movement decades earlier. "Each of you has the power to create change," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You don't need to have a loud voice. You don't need to carry a big stick. All you need is the courage to stand firm in your beliefs, to treat others with respect, and to refuse to back down in the face of injustice. That's how change begins. That's how we make a better world." The crowd listened, rapt, moved by the quiet wisdom of a man who had turned a simple act of defiance into a legacy that would outlive him. Emma and Ryan stood nearby, their eyes shining with pride as they watched the man who had changed their lives once again inspire the hearts of everyone in the room. As the summit concluded, Samuel was presented with an award, honoring his lifetime of service to humanity. The plaque read, "To Samuel Greene, whose quiet strength and steadfast dignity showed us the path to justice." Samuel accepted the award with tears in his eyes, his heart full as he looked out at the audience, knowing his journey had touched lives far beyond his own. With the success of the Greene Foundation, cities around the world began reaching out to establish local chapters. Each chapter was dedicated to the same values that had driven Samuel: respect, dignity, unity, and peace. From small towns in rural America to bustling metropolises overseas, the Foundation's message spread like wildfire, uniting people under the simple, universal belief that every person deserved respect. As a part of this global expansion, the Foundation launched a new program called Watch Greene Global, which provided resources and support to communities facing issues of discrimination and division. The program funded educational workshops, community development projects, and social justice initiatives, helping people everywhere build bridges and create lasting change. One of the most impactful Greene Global projects was a community center in South Africa, built to serve as a safe space for dialogue, education, and reconciliation. The center became a place where people from different backgrounds and experiences could come together to share stories, find common ground, and work toward healing. The impact of Greene Global extended beyond physical spaces. The Foundation partnered with schools to incorporate Samuel's teachings into their curriculums, offering programs that focused on empathy, historical awareness, and peaceful activism. Young people across the world were growing up learning that they, too, had the power to make a difference. As Samuel grew older, he found peace in knowing that the work he had started was being carried forward by others. His legacy was no longer just his own. It belonged to every person who had been inspired to live with a little more kindness, to stand a little taller, and to speak a little louder for what was right. On his 95th birthday, the town held a celebration in Green Square, bringing together old friends, family, Foundation members, and supporters from around the world. Samuel sat in his wheelchair surrounded by loved ones as he looked out over the crowd that had gathered to honor him. A young girl, no more than 6, approached him with a bouquet of flowers in her hand. "Are you Mr. Greene?" she asked, her voice filled with the innocence and curiosity of youth. Samuel smiled, his eyes twinkling as he nodded. "Yes, that's me." The little girl handed him the flowers. "My mommy said you're a hero. She said you taught people to be nice to each other." Samuel chuckled softly, taking the flowers with gratitude. "Well, I just wanted people to remember that kindness is a choice we all get to make." The girl grinned, then turned back to her mother, who watched with a look of pride. Samuel's heart swelled as he realized that his story, his journey, would live on long after he was gone. It would be carried forward by people like this young girl, by everyone who had ever believed in the power of a simple act of respect. Years later, after Samuel had peacefully passed away, Green Square became a symbol of enduring hope and resilience. People came from all over the world to visit the square, paying homage to the man whose quiet defiance had sparked a movement. His statue, seated as if still at the booth in the diner, bore an inscription that encapsulated his life's message. Here sat Samuel Greene, a man of dignity, whose quiet strength taught us that every person has the right to respect. Let his memory inspire us to live with kindness, courage, and unyielding compassion. The Greene Foundation continued to flourish, its chapters growing, its programs expanding, each new initiative rooted in the values Samuel had championed. Each year, on the anniversary of his first sit-down in the diner, communities held a moment of silence, a global acknowledgement of the man who had shown the world that the simplest acts could carry the most profound meaning. Emma, now the executive director of the Greene Foundation, stood at the square one late afternoon, watching as the sun set over Samuel's statue. She knew that his legacy was more than just the foundation, the scholarships, or even the square itself. It was the belief he had instilled in every person who had ever heard his story, that they, too, had the power to make a difference, to create a world where respect and dignity reigned. As the light of day faded and the square grew quiet, Emma felt a deep sense of peace. Samuel's journey had begun with a simple act, a single choice, and it had become a beacon that would guide generations to come. And in that quiet moment, she knew, without a doubt, that his light would never go out. Samuel Greene's life became more than just a story. It became a movement, a light in the world that encouraged countless others to stand up for respect and dignity. From Greene Square to communities worldwide, his legacy lived on through the work of the Greene Foundation, through every person inspired by his quiet courage, and through every small act of kindness carried out in his name. Samuel's journey showed the world that true change doesn't need force or noise. Sometimes it only takes one person sitting down in quiet defiance, holding firm to their beliefs. His life proved that even the smallest actions, born of integrity and compassion, could ripple out and transform communities, bridging divides and building unity. As visitors continued to pour into Greene Square, as children grew up learning about his legacy, Samuel's message remained clear. Real strength lies in kindness, in treating others with respect, and in choosing to believe in the good within us all. Samuel Greene's story is a reminder that we all have the power to create change. You don't need to be famous, wealthy, or influential to make a difference. You only need the courage to stand up for what is right, the willingness to show respect, and the determination to spread kindness wherever you go. As you go forward, carry Samuel's legacy with you. Look for moments to show compassion. Stand firm in your values even when it's difficult. Choose to believe in the possibility of a better world, and let that belief guide your actions. Let Samuel's story inspire you to be a light in your own community. Be the person who brings people together, who lifts others up, and who reminds the world that respect and dignity are for everyone. Together, we can continue the work Samuel started and create a world built on kindness, justice, and unity. Samuel Greene's journey reminds us all the power to change the world lies within each of us, one small, courageous act at a time. Did Samuel's journey inspire you? Don't forget to like this video to support stories of strength and dignity, subscribe to stay connected with more powerful stories that spark change, and share this video with friends to keep Samuel's message alive. Let's spread respect and unity together.